Hello, everyone. Welcome to this DecisionWise webinar. My name is Justin Warner, and I will be the host of our webinar today. Our topic today is how to build an effective 360-degree feedback assessment. And I'm grateful that we have two experts in this area who are joining us today. Mr. Christian Nielson, who is the Vice President of Consulting at DecisionWise, and Mr. Dave Long, who is the Vice President of Assessments here at DecisionWise as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise on this topic.
Our pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, I have some housekeeping items that I need to take care of, so please bear with me with these items. First off, this webinar qualifies for 1 hour of SHRM and HRCI credit. Following the webinar, we will send out an email with those particular codes for all of the participants who meet the viewing requirements. If you are watching this webinar on demand, please email me at info@decisionwise.com. That's info@decisionwise.com. Once you have completed watching the webinar, we'll verify your viewing requirements and send you the codes. This webinar, along with all of our other webinars, can be viewed on demand on the DecisionWise website or this particular Bright Talk channel. We will not be sharing the slides, these particular slides from this presentation. However, you are welcome to go back and rewatch and fast forward and find those areas that you want to review. We do welcome your questions during the webinar. We will try to answer those questions as we go along. On your Bright Talk panel, there is a question section. Please feel free to ask your questions in that panel, and we will address those as we go. Lastly, while the COVID restrictions are loosening, we are in different locations, so we apologize in advance if we end up speaking over each other. So Dave and Christian, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you and let you kick things off for us.
Thank you, Justin. This is Dave Long. I'm here with Christian Nielson. I want to, first of all, just kind of talk through what we're going to discuss today as part of this webinar. We want to first do a review about 360 in general. I'll give you some of the benefits, maybe do a little definition of 360. And also, we want to talk about some of the terms we're going to be using. I know some of the terms we'll use are pretty common terms that I'm sure all of you have used in the past. But just so we have a shared definition of what we're talking about when we refer to these things, we've got a quick glossary of terms that we want to go through. We also want to talk about, when you're at the beginning of looking at designing a 360 assessment, what are the key considerations? Because there's a number of different ways you can go, as we will discuss. But we want to talk about, what are we thinking about as we look at which direction do you go with a 360 assessment? So we're going to talk about those considerations. In fact, that's going to be hopefully a good back and forth conversation with what I've seen versus what Christian has seen in his experience working with 360. We're going to talk about using competency models in 360 design. We want to talk about something that we call derailers, a part of an assessment that we use to kind of measure the dark side of leadership, or where people might be going too far, or where they might be blocking their own careers through the behaviors that they're experiencing. And it's just something that we found very useful in assessment design. And then we're going to talk about some general best practices in writing assessment items. I know a lot of you are wanting some of that tactical guidance in terms of how do we write good questions or good assessment items for our 360 assessment. So we will talk about all of those things today. First, let's talk about what is a 360. And hopefully, if you all are here looking to build a 360 assessment, you already know what a 360 is. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to talk about how I think about this, or how we think about it here at DecisionWise. The first thing that I think about when I think about a 360 is, at its core, a 360 assessment is a self-assessment. It's an opportunity for somebody who, we're always assessing ourselves in kind of an informal way. We're like, did I come across the right way in that conversation? Those sorts of things. We do that on a daily basis. However, a 360 assessment gives me a chance to look at myself from a whole bunch of different angles. I can see, laid out in front of me all of these competencies that the organization has deemed as important or valuable competencies for me to gain skill and experience in. And I get to rate myself on all of those things. I get the chance to evaluate myself from all of those different angles. The second thing is that I have the opportunity to get feedback from my supervisor. And this is the natural feedback relationship that should exist between you and your supervisor. And when we do a 360, we really encourage the organizations that do it to make sure that the supervisor's feedback is not confidential, that the person going through this gets the supervisor's feedback so that they can see exactly what their supervisor is saying, because that relationship should always exist. But there's also this other opportunity to look at these other groups and see what experience am I creating for them? How are they perceiving me? So we look at peers, and if you're a leader, we'll look at your direct reports, and then any others that might be out there, other rater groups that we might be able to assemble, common people that have a common relationship with me. We might put them into another group in order to kind of evaluate that. So that's how we look at 360s. At the core, it's a self-assessment. Of course, we get that feedback from our supervisors, but this opportunity to see the really big values, this opportunity to see it from all these different angles. How do my peers see me? How my direct reports see me? And how do others see me? When we're designing a 360, we want to keep this in mind, because when we write items for the assessment, and I'm using items as shorthand for questions, because what we use in our assessments are statements that are associated with a rating scale as opposed to actual questions. So when I say items, I'm really talking about questions on the assessment. But when we write an item on the assessment, we want to make sure that each of these rater groups would be able to educatedly answer that. So there's some things that direct reports could maybe answer that peers could not answer, and so forth. So let's talk about the benefits of 360-degree feedback, just to kind of so that you can understand why this might benefit you, the person that would be going through it, and also the organization. The first thing is a 360 is really a great instrument to expand perspective, and it'll expand the perspective of the participant going through. Whereas they've always been evaluating themselves, now they get this chance to look into the evaluation from a bunch of other perspectives. And so it's really valuable from that perspective. We also hope that a 360 will promote dialogue. We get all this feedback in a 360. And one of the main things that we will coach participants to do is to seek additional advice following the 360. Hopefully that 360 will help somebody narrow down development items to 1, 2, maybe 3 areas that they want to develop. And then they can go and kind of talk to other people and continue that feedback process going forward. If we do 360 the right way and 360 assessment design the right way, we can use the 360 assessment to set and clarify expectations. If we look at this from a leadership perspective, if we're using a 360 that is designed for leaders, and we have all these competencies and behaviors that we're listing out on this 360, that's really a communication to that leader that these are the things, these are the competencies and skills that the organization finds important for them to develop and to be skilled at. So we are setting and clarifying expectations with whatever we put on that 360. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this webinar today, and one of the reasons why we want to be very careful about putting together the right assessment for your organization. 360-degree feedback assessment encourages development. It's always feedback with the future in mind, saying, how am I going to use this in order to develop myself and become better in the future? It can be a tool to raise accountability. When I know that I'm going to have a 360 in the future, it makes me act a little bit differently around my peers, my direct reports, those people that I know will be providing me feedback in the future. I know that I'm accountable for some of those actions. And then ultimately, the hope is that the 360-degree feedback process will enhance performance.
And Dave, I might just add on that last slide. I love these benefits, and I think it's worth pointing out these are some of the benefits you can realize within your organization when we get 360 right. And so, and part of that is what we're here to talk about today in terms of designing the right instrument or the assessment, making sure that's dialed in correctly for the organization. And part of that is running an effective program, which we'll be covering in future webinars and podcasts and things like that. But I like that these are kind of the hallmarks of getting it right. When we design the right approach, we implement it well, these are some of the benefits we can realize.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think assessment design is only the first part of getting it right, as you put it, Christian, because creating the right assessment for your organization is a huge part of setting the right expectations. around this process.
And a lot of times I've heard you say this to your clients. I've certainly said it as well. I think we both picked it up probably from healthcare. One of the goals, at a minimum, we don't want anything to get worse because we run a 360.
Right.
And if the ideal is we're realizing these benefits, but we also want to keep in mind, do no harm. We don't want to overlook some of the risks if we don't take this seriously and put some real thought into it in the early stages.
So let's talk really quickly about some of the vocabulary we'll be using. I already told you that we use the word item. You can think about that as a question on the assessment, but we use the word item to reflect the fact that it's a statement rather than a question that we're using. But let's talk about some of the other vocabulary. A behavior. When I'm talking about behavior, I'm talking about a specific observable behavioral manifestation of a learned competency. In other words, I'm talking about a component part of a larger competency. A behavior is something that I can see somebody do. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about a behavior in the context of a 360 assessment. A competency, I just use the word, a competency, capability, or skill relevant to the successful completion of work functions. Of course, there's competence in many, many areas, but when we talk about competencies related to 360 assessments, we're talking about competencies that would be very applicable to the work that person is doing in the organization for which they work. And the last thing that we'll talk about is a competency model, which is a collection of interrelated competencies or skill categories, which together define a success profile for a common group of leaders or professionals. So this is the combination of all competencies. To simplify this a little bit, how do they relate? Most 360 assessments are based on competency models. A competency model is a collection of competencies, and a competency is a collection of behaviors or behavioral statements. So when we look at designing the assessment, we want to start at what are the competencies that we want to include in this assessment, or what collection of competencies can we put together as a model for good leadership in this organization, or good, whatever it might be. It might not be a leader assessment. It could be an individual contributor assessment. I often think about 360s in terms of ways to evaluate leaders, but it could be for anybody in the organization. So what's a model for competence for the position that you are measuring, or what's a model for competence as a leader in this organization? And then what are the component parts of that model? So the competencies that would go into it. And then also, as we look at each competency, how would we define that competency by observable behaviors? And when we break it down to that level, we have a 360 assessment most of the time. So let's talk more about that. But before we do, I do want to talk about, as we look to build a 360 assessment, there's all these different considerations that we want you to think about before you put all this effort into building the assessment. So we'll start with this one, and all of these are framed in form of a question, and they're questions that we hope that you ask yourself. And we'll talk about, as we look at each of these questions, we'll talk about the considerations for each of these questions. So will the 360 be used for development purposes or for performance measurement? So that's an important question to ask. Most organizations go into the 360 process thinking we're using this for development purposes. And they do all these things with the results of 360s to represent that they actually were looking to measure the performance of their teams. If you are looking to measure the performance of an individual, you can certainly do that with a 360. But the way that you design the assessment is going to be different for performance versus development. Performance, we're going to be much more succinct, and we're going to be much more specific in the actions that we're looking for. We want to see actions that have actually been seen, and they're very specific and not open for interpretation. When we're designing a 360 for development purposes, we're very open to interpretation in terms of what each behavioral statement can mean. So we want to design it differently if it's for development purposes or for performance measurement. And if you were creating a development 360, we want to do things, and we want to take a process that does not make it look like this was actually a performance measurement exercise. The next consideration is who will be receiving a 360. As I mentioned before, it can be for any number of people. Is it for leaders? Is it for line level leaders? Is it for executive leaders? Is it for somebody in between? Or is it for some professional individual contributor in your organization? That's an enormous consideration when we start to choose competencies, because we don't want to use a leadership competency model in order to assess a person who's an individual contributor, that may be a huge contributor in the organization, but doesn't have those leadership responsibilities.
Yeah, I think a good example on that is, items related to setting organizational strategy might not apply to an individual contributor role in a lot of cases. So a really great consideration.
The next thing you want to ask yourself is how many people will participate. When we talk about participants, we're talking about the people that are receiving feedback, or they're receiving the 360 on themselves. And the consideration is this assessment going to one person or a few people, or is it going to many people? Because the number of people that this assessment goes to will go a long way to determining the level of effort that you're going to be putting into the assessment design process. Before you put in hours upon hours of creating a custom assessment, you might want to think, is this only going to 2 or 3 people? And if so, it's probably good enough for you to adopt an existing assessment. And most 360 vendors will have existing assessments. I know DecisionWise has assessments that we're very happy with for leaders at all levels, and also for individual contributors. So before you just say, I'm going to put all this effort into creating an assessment, it may be that you may be looking to take an assessment off the shelf and say, we're only using this for a few people, therefore we're doing it. If we're using it for a wide swath of the organization, if a lot of people in the organization are going through this, that's an opportunity for you to step backwards for just a second and say, all right, this is going to many leaders in this organization. That means I have this opportunity to set a standard for leadership using this 360, to create a competency model of what it means to be a successful leader here in this organization, and to design the assessment accordingly. So you want to think about, is it for a lot of people, or is it just for a few people? And the amount of effort you put into it is going to be determined by answering that question. How often will people have the opportunity to get 360 feedback? Is this a one-off, or is this something you plan to do on an annual basis, or a semi-annual basis, or a biannual basis? However you want to look at it, how often are people going to get opportunities to do this? If it is a one-off and we're not planning on having any sort of follow-up, then it's less important what we put into the 360. And I think on those one-off processes, it's okay to use a more off-the-shelf 360 and focus more of your attention on the development after the 360 rather than on the development of the 360 assessment. And the last consideration is, how well defined are the success criteria for the positions going through the process? If you have a success profile for a group of people that are going through the 360, then you might as well use that success profile in order to design your 360 instrument. If you don't have that, then you're kind of starting from scratch a little bit in terms of identifying the competencies that are important to the successful completion of that work. But if you already have a success profile, then you may want to think about starting with that success profile as a starting point for your 360 design.
Dave, before you jump to the next section, can I just quickly answer a procedural question that came through? So the question came about, how do we get credit, Shermer HRCI credit for this? Everyone who completes the viewing the webinar, we will email out the credit codes for everyone who has completed the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Justin. All right, let's talk about building a 360 assessment and how you might approach it. So the first thing that you could do, an organization could do, or you as the HR leader, or you as the person that is administering 360s in your organization, the first thing that you could do is use a standard assessment. I've already talked about that a little bit. So that's one option. So all the rest of this conversation may be moot to you if you are going to use a standard assessment. Nevertheless, I encourage you to hang on for that HRCI credit at the end. I'm just kidding. I think it's all useful discussion, but it may be that we get to the end of this discussion and you say, you know what, what's right for me is to just use a standard assessment. There's also the possibility that you would create an assessment from a competency library, and we'll talk about that and how to do that. This can be a much easier process in terms of if you wanted to create a custom assessment for your organization, using a competency library that's already established can be a very helpful tool in creating that assessment. The third thing that you could do is establish an assessment based on your own competency model. If your organization has a success profile or a competency model, or maybe you have behavioral anchored rating scales already in place for leaders in your organization and you want to borrow from there, that's great. We absolutely encourage you to do that. Establish your own model, especially if the success criteria in your organization are particularly unique. If the competencies that you need to develop are particularly unique, then it may make a lot of sense to establish your own assessment using a competency model that you have internally. And the fourth option is one that a lot of organizations take, which is to take a hybrid approach. We're not using a standard assessment, but we're borrowing from it. We're taking from a competency library. We have some competencies internally that we use. We have some values. We'll talk about that as well. So let's talk first about creating a 360 assessment from an existing competency model.
I'll jump in and walk us through some of this. So when to adopt an existing model? An existing model fits well with the kind of when an existing model fits well with the kind of culture you want to establish or reinforce. So if you've got some other initiatives around building a culture, nudging an existing culture to a few different strategic directions, then you might want to adopt an existing model that aligns well with that. If there's a need to launch 360 assessments very quickly, you might want to leverage an existing competency model. And we'll show you an example of an existing competency model that we've developed that we use with many of our clients. You only plan to run a small number of people through the 360 experience. Dave mentioned this before. I think it's a really great call out. If you're not looking to run a robust 360 program, or this isn't something that you're going to be expanding and rolling out through the entire organization, it's just, ad hoc 2 or 3 here or there, maybe a few a year, then you might just want to leverage an existing competency model, something that gets you most of the way there. That might be a more worthwhile exercise versus developing a completely custom model for your organization. You lack resources or buy-in to create an org-specific model. That's a reality many of you are facing. Many of us are facing that. We're one person leading an entire HR team, or we're just completely lean and wearing a lot of hats. It might be a luxury we don't have to completely invest our time in developing a model. And then there's interest in, you lack resources or buy-in to create an org-specific model. Sometimes we have to leverage an existing model to introduce 360s into an organization to build a level of trust and comfort and also prove the value of the exercise before we can take it a step further and build a custom model. I have a number of clients kind of in that range right now. They're on a journey to taking this further. And then this last one, there's an interest in external benchmarking. That's one of the benefits of leveraging an existing model, like the one we'll show you in a moment, that you can use external comparisons. We've run thousands upon thousands of leaders at different levels of an organization through our standard assessments, leveraging our competency model. And so if you're looking to compare your internal leaders against some external standard, that is one consideration with using something that's proven and already existing.
And that's a conversation I actually had recently with an organization, which is, look, they maybe felt like, hey, we're unique enough that we want to create our own model or our own assessment to measure our leaders. But there was very high interest in the leaders to see how do I compare with leaders outside of this organization? And there's definite value to taking this assessment and saying, how do I compare to the other leaders in my organization, which you can always do. Internal benchmarking is always available on a 360. If you use consistent items across a large group of people, then that internal benchmarking will be available. But there are times when there are unique cultures or organizations that could use their own competency model, but their desire to see that external benchmarking is high enough that they would just go with an existing 360 assessment. Use the one that's off the shelf, because that's the one that's going to have the greatest comparison to external people.
Right. And I really love the call out that if this is new to your organization, that's often a really great way to get going, introduce the concept, get the value, use those external benchmarks, and then make a decision. Do we want to go a bit more tailored to our needs and really focus on those internal going forward?
Okay. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Christian.
No, go. I was just going to say, maybe it's a great opportunity to take a look at what we use as our internal competency model.
Right. And essentially, this is the competency model we use. Now, remember, when I talk about a competency model, I'm saying that this is the model from which we base our assessment, our 360 assessment. So we try to simplify this as much as we possibly can. And we create these three larger categories, which we say, look, a leader, an effective leader, and this is for the leadership intelligence assessment that we run. So it is geared toward leaders. We also have others that are geared toward individual contributors, but this is geared toward leaders. So we say, look, there are three basic things that we're looking for from a leader. One is that we want them to get results in their area, whatever they oversee. We want to see that they are tactically running the team in a way that produces results. The second thing we want to do is, look, if there are changes that happen, we want to make sure that they are effective at leading change and bringing people along in the change process. And the third thing that we want to make sure that they do is that we want to make sure that they engage their people. So we have these three major competencies or foundational competencies we use, but we say, look, in order to get results or lead change or engage people, you have to be good at a few things, right? So we have, in getting results, we have a number of competencies that maybe we would consider to be sub-competencies of this larger competency of getting results. Things like having professional expertise, being results-oriented, empowering people, holding people accountable, focusing on the customer, all things that we would put into the category of getting results. And in leading change, we have aligning people to the organization, change management skills, collaboration, innovation, all skills that are related to leading change and engaging people. We're taking care of the wellness of people. We're refining our interpersonal communication, developing others, creating psychological safety, and we're engaging. We're using engaging leadership tactics. So we have a model that we use that we think is a pretty good model that we can take almost anywhere and would be applicable. But again, there's not applicable to everybody. And some people say, you know what, our culture is unique enough that we would want to create our own assessment.
And Dave, I might also add, while we're talking about these kind of off the shelf or these kind of existing assessments and competency models, another consideration is there are existing 360 assessments kind of off the shelves already kind of prepared and run with a lot of organizations around different industries. For example, not only do we have them at executive and kind of director level, manager and individual contributor, we also have things like healthcare, physician leaders, or public sector. So those are worthwhile conversations to have as you're exploring off the shelf options. If there's some industry specific items or different levels within the organization. So if you're not going down the complete design route, you want to pull something off the shelf, there are often a lot of really great options to choose from.
That's a really great point. And like I said, also, in addition to that, there's not just leader assessments, there's individual contributor assessments as well. And there's executive leader. If you're running your executive team through something like this, there would be other competencies that we'd be looking for from our executives that wouldn't be necessarily in this generic leader assessment. So there are other standard assessments out there that would be helpful to you in your situation. So don't overlook the standard assessments, especially if you're only running a few people through. It can be very helpful to have this, and you get the added benefit of external benchmarking when you use them. All right, next one would be building from competency libraries. I personally have seen many different forms of competency libraries, and so I feel pretty ready to talk about this with you all. So when you might use a competency library, and we'll talk more about what a competency library is. We'll show you what our competency library looks like. But if the organization needs or the needs of the people that are going through this assessment cannot be met by an existing competency model or the existing assessment we just showed you on the previous page, then we might be thinking about, okay, I still want to customize this, but I don't want to necessarily put in the effort into writing this from scratch, writing an assessment from scratch. Then we might use a competency library to bring in several different competencies and put them all into sort of one assessment. So if there's a need to establish expectations unique to your organization, so there's uniqueness in your organization and you need to be able to address some of those unique situations, then we might use a competency library instead of an established model in order to assemble this 360. If you value customization with minimal effort, you want customization, but you don't want to put a ton of effort into writing individual assessment items and individual behaviors and defining each competency, then a really great thing to do would be to borrow from a competency library. And then also competency libraries carry the added benefit of having help or action planning resources associated with them. So I think the benefit of having a competency library is that, when we establish, at least at DecisionWise, when we establish competencies, we also say, look, here's some ideas for action. Here's some things to think about. Here's some resources that you can read about this particular competency. And those are big advantages to using a competency library, because those sort of training materials on the back end are already created for you.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, just because this is informed by a couple very real client experiences I've had, starting with a competency model, even if you know you need to build something very unique for your organization, it's often helpful to start with a competency model just to get a feel for the best practice. The competency models or these libraries, ours included, are definitely refined. It reflects a lot of learning how to do it the right way and learning from mistakes in the past to make sure that we have statements that are actionable and conform to kind of best practice. And the reason that's useful, I've seen a few client examples where, and it's certainly more the exception, but I've seen it on a few occasions that, maybe someone very passionate with really great intentions internally says, oh, I'll write this. I've had examples where the CEO said, I'm going to write the 360. And despite best intentions, if they've never written one, sometimes that can go off the rails and go some very strange directions. So it's a great resource to pull in, even if you're going to deviate from those libraries. It gives you a great kind of informed starting template so that you can get a feel for the mechanics of how a properly worded statement, what that looks like, what it feels like, and then you can use that as a jumping off point for further customization. That's
a really good point. And I've actually run into those same situations where it's like really well-intentioned people put together an assessment, but the assessment has all kinds of problems with it. You can avoid a lot of those problems. And we'll talk about some of those problems, by the way. That's part of this discussion today. But you can avoid a lot of those problems with going with canned statements that come from a competency library. Yeah. And you can create a pretty custom assessment by using this.
I just, maybe a side note for Dave, I think internally we ought to start keeping a hall of fame for strange assessments that we've seen through the years. They're great examples that we can learn from that we occasionally pick up just in the work we're doing.
For sure. Okay, so I meant to overload you with a screen of a lot of words, a wall of text here. I wanted to kind of show you how the breadth of a good competency library. Honestly, at DecisionWise, we've been doing 360s for over 20 years. We went through the process of assembling a competency library because we saw some of the other libraries out there, and we thought that they were woefully insufficient in terms of being able to use that competency library in order to create a 360 assessment. So when we created our library, we cast a very wide net in order to say, look, let's err on the side of including too many competencies in this library, so we cover almost any situation that an organization could run into. So each of these competencies we have will have 4 behavioral statements related to them. And what you would do is you would go through this and say, is it important in our organization that we have business acumen? Is it important that we have empathy? Do we need listening? Do we need negotiating skills or networking? Whatever it might be that you have need of, then you can pull those in and you'll have a pretty good group of behavioral statements behind it in order to create an assessment. So that's the idea in putting together a lot of these assessments. And we try to modernize some of the competencies that we use. For example, I've seen a number of competency libraries that don't include things like emotional intelligence or systems thinking, or some of these things that are kind of more modern competencies that we're looking for from leadership. We've included those in our library in order to make sure that we have something. But the point is, using a library can really simplify the customization process. And literally, a customization process could look like you going through a list like this and saying, these are the 10 things that I want in my assessment. And your assessment is essentially built at that point. So competency libraries can be very helpful. So let's give you a quick example. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to give you an example, let's say you're in an organization that is undergoing rapid change, or in one of those organizations that are serial changes. You change all the time and change is never going to stop. Then what we might be looking for from a leadership level, for example, in that organization, is that they're able to adapt themselves. They have adaptability. they're able to manage change, they have change management skills, or that competency is important in your organization, and that they're resilient. So let's look at, so if you decided to go through and just choose those 3 from the library, then immediately you have 4 behavioral statements for each, or 4 what we would call individual assessment items or questions that you can plug right into your assessment. So you're looking for somebody who's adaptable, then that's somebody who adjusts priorities rapidly to changing situations and conditions, shows optimism and enthusiasm when facing new or changing situations. They've got the change management things, they've got the resilient things, and so right away already you have a third or a fourth of your assessment is already built just by saying, look, we want to drive strong change leadership in the organization. Another example, if you wanted to establish a culture of caring, a lot of organizations are realizing that caring is an important aspect of building inclusiveness or building belonging in the organization. And you say, this is something we want to drive in our organization. Well, you can build a competency model from the competency library that includes things like, well, caring, or emotional intelligence, or empathy. If you chose those three competencies from the library, then the assessment is already written for you, because it brings in behavioral statements for each of those. So you get the point. We don't need to read each of these behavioral statements in order to say, is this something that works? It's a really great way to build an assessment by just saying, this is the thing that we're trying to drive. These are the competencies that I think we need in order to drive it. And if you can determine those 2 things, you've written an assessment on your own by simply dragging those in from the competency library.
And Dave, I think it's a good place to answer this. We had a question come in. Do you only include 1 behavior statement per item on the 360? And I think you can see kind of from this screen here, we would recommend you include more than that. So you'd want to be very selective about the competencies, but for each competency, you would want enough behavioral statements that you can see it from a few different angles and give enough intel that the participant could take action, or at least have a sense of where they need to do some additional follow-up. So over time, we've kind of settled on this sense of 4 behavioral statements. I mean, you could do a few more here or there, but that feels like the right balance in our experience.
Think about it this way too. How many statements do you need in order to define the competency that you're looking for? And without double barreling, and without trying to measure more than one thing per statement, how many statements do you need in order to measure that competency? And that's how many statements you can use. And so there are some situations where you could define a competency with a single statement. But there are, I think, much more situations where you would need, 3 or 4 or 5 different statements or behavioral statements in order to define what we're looking for from that competency. So when we design a competency, we're looking at what are all the aspects of this competency. We're not just looking to how do we measure caring 4 times. What we're saying is, what are the different aspects of caring, and how do we measure those? Honestly, as many behavioral statements as you need in order to measure that. But if you're going too far beyond 4 or 5, consider that you may be trying to measure more than one competency.
And Dave, in the DecisionWise competency library, each one of our competencies has 4 behavioral statements, correct?
Correct. Yep. That's the exact number on each one of them. And we like that for a number of reasons. We think that it's pretty sufficient to use 4 statements in order to describe most competencies, but also it fits on one page in our report. So that's the kind of other reason why we use 4.
Yeah. And Dave, really fast before you jump on a little bit further, what about rating skills? So each one of these, do you have a 5-point scale, a 7-point scale, 3-point scale? Kind of talk through rating skills first.
And most of the time we use a 7-point behavioral scale, which is judging how strong the behavior is in a person. But it's not necessary to adopt our scale necessarily. You can use an agreement scale. A lot of organizations are more comfortable with an agreement scale, like a Likert scale that goes from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 6. So you can use an agreement scale. We like the behavioral scale because it gives descriptive words of how well they're doing each of these actions. And also, if you're looking for benchmarking, you're using a standard assessment looking for benchmarking, then you would want to use our standard behavioral scale in order to get access to that benchmarking. But you can use a Likert scale or a scale of 1 to 10. You could use a 5-point or 7-point agreement scale if you choose, but I think the scale is pretty flexible in terms of what you want to do or how you want to build that scale. I would use some of these tested scales that have been used in other places and are pretty solid.
And I'll just add on that, and I know we've got some ground to cover, but any scale you use, those are the trade-offs to consider. If you're looking for some of those external comparisons, you might want to go with your provider. So, example, use that 7-point behavioral scale. The other thing that you would want to build over time is an understanding of how your organization uses whatever scale you select. So to see if a 7-point scale, for example, I've seen, engineering cultures are going to be more focused on the actual wording of the scale and often a little more critical. All that to say, you might, over time, you'll be able to kind of calibrate how does your organization react with your scale, and some of those internal norms will become more important over time.
Right. Using a custom competency model to make your assessment. So your organization has a custom model, you have a success profile, you have whatever you might have that defines competence in the position that you're looking to measure. And many organizations will say, we have a competency model for all leaders that we use, which I really love that approach, just because it's sort of defining the culture of the organization by using a competency model. These are the norms and behaviors that we expect from our leaders. We can do that. If you have a custom model, those models take many shapes. It can be a very simple, basic model that looks a lot like our 3 foundational competencies. We want our leaders to be able to do these 3 things. So it can be very basic, but there's also models out there that are very complex, that for each of the competencies that you're measuring, you have a full scale. This is what a level 1 looks like, a 2 looks like, a 3 looks like, behavioral anchored rating scale associated with the model. So they take many shapes. And because they take many shapes, condensing a model, a custom model that you already have in your organization, a model that you've established in your organization, we think is really important to use that model if that's what you have. But it can be a little bit complicated to try to get that into assessment form. So we'll talk about in a minute best practices for writing some of the assessment items that you might have to write when you're adopting, when you're using a custom model, the one that you already have in place in your organization. When to use a custom model, as I said, if you already have something in place, an existing competency model already in place or established in your organization, you'd want to use that model in order to create your assessment. You want to be deliberate in establishing leader norms and behaviors to shape the culture of the organization. You plan to use the competency model widely in your organization. In other words, it's not just for a few leaders. It's to go out to pretty much all the leaders, or it's not just for a few individual contributors. It's for all of our professional working staff that we're doing this. Then we'd want to maybe adopt a custom model in that case. You plan to tie the competency model to hiring criteria and performance reviews. If this is part of a larger initiative to say, look, we need to develop this success profile in our organization, and we're going to do that by running the 360 and also hiring for this success profile and also in our performance reviews, then we want to make sure all those are aligned. We wouldn't want to go rogue with the 360 and measure different things than you're measuring in these other areas. We'd want to align those things. And then the last reason why you might want to use a custom competency model is that success in your organization is difficult to define using generic models or descriptions. And that includes the competency library that we just showed you. If it's difficult to define using that or a generic model, then you definitely would want to use a custom model in that case. Many organizations use a hybrid approach. They will combine some of these different things that we've seen. So success profiles that they already have, organizational value statements. So a lot of organizations will have a value statement that includes some competencies that you can put into an assessment. Other existing competency models, maybe they borrow from the DecisionWise model, say we want to use these 5 competencies from that, and then we're going to build some of our own things. They'll take a few things from the competency library, a few things from the model, a few things from value statements. You're getting the idea of how they do it. It's kind of a Frankenstein approach to doing it. And when I say Frankenstein, it sounds like it would be a disaster. But actually, I think that this hybrid approach is a really good approach for somebody looking for a custom model and looking to really establish norms and behaviors in the organization without having to go through the huge effort of writing everything from scratch. To be able to pull from different areas is I think a really strong approach to building a great assessment.
Great. Hey, Dave, I know we got ground to cover, but I do want to just go back to that page really quick.
Yep.
You've mentioned several times success profiles. Can you just give some examples of a success profile and any tips and how you might develop a success profile?
A success profile is essentially a competency model. And so what we've defined as a competency model is kind of what it is. Essentially, it is, these are the things that this is a profile of a person who's successful in this role.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main points of this presentation. A lot of our clients come to us without I think a key realization that when you create a 360, you're also communicating to leaders what is expected of them and what you're assuming would exemplifies a successful leader in this organization. And so this success profile terminology that Dave keeps coming back to, I think is an important part of this. It's what are those expectations we're setting? And there's different ways to derive that. One, you could look at positive deviance. Meaning who are the winners in the organization? Where do you see some kind of role models that have really thrived in your environment and kind of embody what you're looking for? And how would you describe or characterize their performance? And if you can get a large enough group there and really kind of surface some of those competencies that way, oftentimes it's aspirational. So for example, there'll be some kind of core universal behaviors that you would work at many organizations. There'll be some things that are unique to your organization. And then there would be also some aspirational items. For example, a lot of organizations are pushing a greater focus on innovation and creativity. And so we might put a few of those things in there to try to nudge or encourage leaders to develop some behaviors that haven't historically been part of the organizational culture or expectations. So a lot goes into it. You can survey, you can focus group, different ways to get there, or you could just take a very surface level approach and observational kind of input to get there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think most organizations don't lay out a very clear success profile for leaders. And Christian and I both work with organizations on more organizational level surveys where we're surveying about employee experience generally. And we see that a lot of people in the organization are having a hard time or their experience is poor when it comes to receiving feedback from their managers. And it says that on the assessment, and the leaders kind of throw their hands up and say, well, what do we need to do to get people to give feedback or to have managers give feedback to their employees? What do we need to do in order to do that? And the question that we'll often ask is, well, what expectation have you set for how, when, and how often you provide feedback to your employees? And they say, well, they just know they're supposed to do it. Okay, well, how do they know? Well, defining a success profile can let them know exactly what you mean by providing frequent quality feedback to your employees. And that's what we have the opportunity to do as we build this assessment. We have the opportunity to define what does success look like, to put it right in front of our leaders and have them rate themselves on it and have them evaluate themselves against that success profile. So when I say success profile, it's kind of shorthand for competency model or for a series of behaviors and skills that we are looking for in order to deem someone a successful leader or person in this position. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this. This is something we include in our assessments as derailers. We've talked about including competencies. We also include these things called derailers. And essentially what we're looking for is in the derailers, these are items that are included in our assessments that are negatively framed. So they use a reverse scale. And we're looking for traits or behaviors that may block short or long-term success. And one of the things that we look for with derailers is they can create awareness of blind spots. And often derailers are strengths that are carried out to an extreme. So let me give you some examples of derailers really quickly. So one of the derailers on our assessment, common derailer we use is micromanages. And we define that as overly controlling or does not empower others, or volatile, loses temper or patience quickly, lacks confidence or arrogance, right? So these are all examples of derailers that we might use. What we're looking for these is not just areas that they're falling short in. Sometimes these are strengths that are taken to an extreme. So we want managers who can manage very attentively, but not to the point where they are micromanagers. We want people with a lot of passion and a lot of zeal for the work that they do, but not to the point where they become volatile. We want people who are humble, but not to the point of lacking confidence. And we want people who are confident, but not to the point of being arrogant. So you can see that a lot of these are just manifestations. So it's okay to have a little bit of a score in these derailers, but when we take it too far, that's when we're seeing a blind spot. And the nice thing about the derailers is it's a check on the competencies. So the competencies say this person has a ton of passion for their work. Then the derailer is a check on that. Well, does that mean that sometimes they become volatile? Well, then we want to know that. That's a blind spot that we can identify by looking at the other side and using a reverse scale and using these derailers. So something to consider. We usually use a standard set of derailers. Even if you have a custom assessment, you use a standard set of derailers, as part of the assessment as well. So something to consider. I didn't want to spend too much time on that because I wanted to get into this last section, which is some of the best practices. So I'm going to look at some of the things to avoid essentially, and we'll tell you how to fix it. A lot of you who have made assessments in the past are familiar with double-barreled assessment items. A double-barreled assessment item will attempt to measure more than one thing using a single item on the assessment. So an example of that is works to ensure the safety and emotional well-being of the people on the team. That sounds like a great statement. But in fact, safety, how we define safety, may be physical safety, and emotional well-being would be something other than that. So it's not that we don't want to measure those things. It's just that we want to measure them separately. So we can create the way that we would solve a double-barreled item is to change to two separate assessment items. So we would change this to works to ensure the safety of the people on the team, and additionally works to ensure the emotional well-being of the people on the team. So double-barreled is a pretty common thing that we run into. It's something that you'll want to watch out for, especially as you're early on in it. It's very tempting to write very verbose statements and really sort of try to describe the behavior you're looking for. But often when we do that, we get into the business of describing more than one behavior that we're looking for. All right, try not to read people's minds with the assessment. So avoid any item that would require raters to guess how other people think or feel. And this is a really tough one. And it's one that I had to kind of get past in my process of becoming somebody who I think is pretty adept at writing these assessments. But an example would be desires to connect with people on an emotional level. I don't know what other people's desires are. I can't read their mind. I can't read their heart and say this is what they definitely want to do. All I can do is see that they demonstrate a desire to connect with people on an emotional level. That's still open for interpretation, but it's not asking me to read their mind. It's asking me to see, do I see a demonstration of them wanting to connect with people on an emotional level? If I don't see that, then there's no way for me to evaluate this person on that. So try to avoid, when you're writing an assessment item and you're building a custom assessment, one of the key things is you try not to read the mind or try to evaluate how other people think or feel using this. We're looking for demonstrated behaviors. Avoid subject-object confusion. This is something that has come up more recently. We've been working on creating gender-neutral pronouns or using gender-neutral pronouns in order to create more inclusive assessments. And if that's an important thing to your organization, trying to make sure that the assessment is inclusive and we're not leaving anybody else by using pronouns, the temptation is to use plural pronouns in place of the traditional he, him, she, her sort of pronouns. So we definitely are in support of making sure that the assessment is as inclusive as possible. But sometimes when we do that, it leaves an assessment item sort of confusing. So aligns others with their version of the future. Well, whose version of the future are we talking about? Are we talking about the subject of this? Are we talking about the others that we're talking about? It's hard to determine who their means. So we would encourage you to fix it by just leaving out the pronouns altogether. So aligns others to a shared vision of the future would be a good enough way to replace this without using a pronoun in it. All right, last one here, and then we'll give you a few quick tips as well. Avoid disconnected assessment items. So use the statements where the participant's name can be inserted at the beginning. And so if I'm writing an assessment, I often will think, okay, if I were writing this assessment with Christian, I would want to be able to put Christian's name at the very beginning of each statement. So obviously in this example, I would have to say Christian able to deliver solid results in challenging situations. That's a disconnected assessment item. What we want is something connected to the subject. Christian delivers solid results in challenging situations.
I do, by the way.
He definitely does. That's why I used you, Christian. I wouldn't use Justin for that.
Let's poll the audience.
No, yeah. All right. Just to kind of sum us up a little bit here. Here's a few other things that we would say when designing assessments. Use straightforward language. We try to shoot for an 8th grade reading level with a lot of the things we do. It's not always possible, but to the extent that we can, we want to make sure that we hit it with very straightforward language. We want to base items on observable behaviors. Limit the length of your assessment. We often don't use any more than 15 competencies and up to 60 behavioral statements as assessment items. Use the active voice where possible. So rather than saying Christian is able to deliver solid results, we would just say Christian delivers solid results, which is more, getting into the active voice in that case. And then avoid using a 360 to measure things that can be objectively measured other ways. And that is something that we run into pretty commonly. So an example of this is HIT's monthly sales targets. There are any number of ways that you can measure that with something other than a 360 assessment. Make sure that you're using the appropriate tools to measure objective things that you can measure through another way, and use the 360 in order to measure some of those things that are more subjective behaviors. So in summary, assessment design may not be necessary if you adopt an existing competency model. We're sorry for wasting your time if you're just going to adopt an existing one. Most 360 assessments are based on competency models. How you use your 360 should inform how you design it. Competency libraries exist to help you design custom assessments easily. And the last thing would be follow best practices when writing your own assessment items, just the best practices that we've just gone through. So thank you everybody for your attention here, but that's what we wanted to present today on designing assessments.
Great. Dave and Christian, thank you so much. A lot of great information here. Just a couple of quick questions that we weren't able to get to. Typically, we have 10 to 12, 13 derailers on our assessments, and our questions usually range with the derailers right around 60 questions. We've also included open-ended comments on these assessments as well, is usually what we will see from the DecisionWise assessments. So thank you all for being a part of this webinar. Hopefully the information's been great. Again, you can rewatch it on demand on our Bright Talk channel or on the DecisionWise website. Dave, Christian, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating.